On a spring morning in 1889, a 29-year-old doctor named Harold Metcalf was sitting in his parlor in the tiny town of Exeter, Rhode Island, when he heard his telegraph machine start clicking. He got up, walked over to the large metal machine, and watched it slowly print text onto a long, thin piece of paper. When it finished printing, Dr. Metcalf tore off the paper and read the telegram. It was a message from one of his neighbors, a farmer named George Brown. George said in this telegram that his only son, 22-year-old Edwin, had fallen ill, and he desperately needed Dr. Metcalf's help. The doctor let out a long sigh. He knew the Browns well. They'd once been a happy family of 9, with George, his wife, their 6 daughters, and their son, but Dr. Metcalf was all too aware of the tragedy that had struck the family over the past few years. 7 years ago, George's wife had come down with a mysterious disease that some locals called the White Death. It caused horrible symptoms like chronic fevers, extreme weight loss, and uncontrollable coughing. People with the disease grew pale and weak, and they got so emaciated that they looked like skeletons. It was like the disease literally drained the life out of them. Now, there were a lot of supposed treatments for the White Death, things like riding on horseback every day or drinking brown sugar mixed with water, but Dr. Metcalf knew these remedies did not work. In fact, he knew there was just no proven way to cure the White Death. Now, Dr. Metcalf had tried to help George's wife 7 years earlier by prescribing healthy food and exercise, but she still just kept on getting sicker. And in fact, she would die a year later, and then almost immediately afterwards, one of George's daughters also began showing symptoms of the dreaded disease. And again, Dr. Metcalf tried to help, but there was nothing he could do, and she also died within just a few months. Even though Dr. Metcalf knew the White Death was basically incurable, he still felt guilty for not being able to help George and his loved ones. And now, after reading George's telegram, Dr. Metcalf feared that Edwin might be the latest member of the Brown family to contract the deadly disease. But there was only one way to find out. Dr. Metcalf quickly packed his medical bag, threw a saddle on his horse, and raced off towards the Browns' farm. 15 minutes later, Dr. Metcalf trotted his horse along a thin country road in Exeter. To his right, he saw a vast field overgrown with weeds, with a crumbling country house right in the center. It was once a prosperous farm, but was now abandoned. The sight made Dr. Metcalf sad. He'd lived in Exeter his whole life, and he'd watched the quaint farming community turn into sort of a ghost town. The Civil War and the White Death had decimated the community, leaving only a third of the population alive. In fact, these days, the town was more commonly known by its nickname, Deserted Exeter. After riding for a few more minutes, Dr. Metcalf reached a modest house on 40 acres of farmland. He knocked on the door, and right away, George Brown answered. He looked haggard, and he quickly led Dr. Metcalf to Edwin's bedroom. Inside the room, the doctor saw Edwin's wife and 5 remaining sisters crowded around a big 4-poster bed. Edwin was lying on the mattress in plain sight, but Dr. Metcalf barely could recognize him. The once husky farmhand had become bony and pale. His cheeks were sunken, his eyes were glassy, and when he tried to speak, he fell into a violent coughing fit. It was obvious to everyone, including the doctor, that Edwin had been gripped by the White Death. As Edwin tried to catch his breath, his father, George, approached the side of the bed and looked at the doctor and asked if there was anything he could do. Dr. Metcalf began rattling off his regular treatment plan, healthy food and exercise, but George stopped him. He said they'd already tried those things with his wife and his daughter, and they hadn't worked. There had to be something different they could try. Dr. Metcalf hesitated, but then he said, yeah, there was another option. But he told them it was an experimental treatment, and so he couldn't guarantee it would work. George said he didn't care. At this point, he was willing to try anything to help Edwin. So Dr. Metcalf explained that some physicians believed that the White Death was caused, or at least was made worse, by living in humid climates, like Rhode Island. So it might help if Edwin moved out of Rhode Island and went somewhere with completely different weather. The doctor suggested Colorado Springs, Colorado, because it was a mountain town with very dry air and high elevations, and so it would be a drastic change from Rhode Island. But there was one really obvious problem. To get to Colorado, Edwin would have to travel 2,000 miles, and this would mean days and days of riding trains and horses, all while Edwin was severely ill, like it wasn't clear if he would live through the journey. Plus, his whole family couldn't just go with him, it would basically be Edwin and maybe his wife. And so after explaining this experimental protocol, Dr. Metcalf went quiet and just watched the Browns as they considered what he had just said. and it was obvious the entire family was very upset and didn't know what to make of this, but at the same time, they knew they had no other choice. And so as the sisters kind of held back tears and whispered amongst each other, and as George looked up at the doctor not sure what to say, finally Edwin, from the bed, croaked out the first words he'd said that day. He said that yes, he and his wife would go to Colorado. Three years later, in January of 1892, Edwin held his wife's hand as they walked through the snow in the Rocky Mountains. The high elevation and dry air in Colorado Springs had worked like a charm. Edwin was back to feeling like his normal self again. After walking a bit longer, Edwin told his wife they should head back home for lunch. When they got to their house, Edwin's wife rushed inside out of the cold, but Edwin stayed for a second and checked the mailbox for any letters from his dad and sisters. And he found there was an envelope, so he opened it and he unfolded the note inside. It was a handwritten letter from his father, and as Edwin scanned the paper, his face fell. The note said that one of Edwin's little sisters, 19-year-old Mercy, had unfortunately passed away. Edwin knew that Mercy had been sick. She'd contracted the White Death almost a year earlier. He had tried to convince her to move out to Colorado with him and his wife because he knew that would cure this, but Mercy said she didn't think she could make the long journey, and she didn't want to leave behind her sisters, and so she had stayed. But now, Mercy was gone, and so Edwin knew he would need to head back to Rhode Island and be there to grieve with his family. A few weeks later, back in Rhode Island, Edwin and his father braced themselves against the harsh winter cold in Exeter, and together, they silently dug rocks out of the frozen ground. They were trying to prepare the field for planting in the spring. It was hard work, but the physical labor was actually a welcome distraction from their grief. Edwin pushed a sharp shovel into the ground, and as he wedged another rock out of the soil, he suddenly felt like a heavy weight was pressing down on his chest. He dropped his shovel and started coughing so hard that it stung his throat. He put a hand over his mouth to block the cough, and when he caught his breath and moved his hand away, he saw that his palm was now speckled with blood. When he looked up, Edwin saw his father staring at him with a horrified expression. They both knew what this meant. Now that he was back in Rhode Island, Edwin's case of the White Death had returned. In March, about a month later, George woke in the night to the sound of his only son coughing violently. George jumped out of bed and rushed to the kitchen to grab a cup of water, and then made his way into Edwin's room, which was dimly lit by an oil lamp. Edwin had become so sick after contracting the White Death that he couldn't go anywhere, and he had been bedridden for the last 2 weeks here in Rhode Island. It was like all the progress he'd made living in Colorado had now been undone, and he was now sicker than he'd been before. He looked frail and gray, and George could see spots on the white bedsheet from where Edwin had been coughing up blood. George held out the cup of water for his son, and Edwin grabbed the glass with shaky hands and drank it in between coughs. Then Edwin looked at his father, and in a hoarse and frightened voice, he said something that terrified George. He said, "She was here. She haunts me." George just stared at his son. He had no idea what his son was talking about, but before George could ask, Edwin was gripped by another coughing fit, and the only thing George could think to do was send for Dr. Metcalf. Less than an hour later, George stood by Edwin's bedside as Dr. Metcalf examined his son. Now, George knew his son was in very bad shape at this point, but he was still shocked when Dr. Metcalf, after examining Edwin, turned to George and just said, "It's in God's hands now." There was apparently nothing he or anyone else could do to help Edwin. George was beyond devastated. He had lost his wife, 2 daughters, and now he was just counting the days until his only son passed away too. He felt totally powerless. But Edwin, despite hearing this grave news, was putting on a brave face. With his voice still hoarse from coughing, he asked his father if he had any whiskey. If his days were indeed numbered, well, they might as well enjoy the last few moments. George nodded and headed to the kitchen, and as he was taking glasses out of the cabinet for the whiskey, he heard a knock at the door, which was odd because it was well past midnight and he never had visitors this late. George set the glasses down, made his way to the door, and opened it up to see 6 of his neighbors standing there on the porch. One of them, an older woman with graying hair, said they'd heard that his son Edwin was sick, and a few of them had seen Dr. Metcalf come over earlier, and so they were concerned. But they said they were not just here to pay their condolences, they were here to try to save him. George had to stop himself from letting out a very bitter laugh. He already knew no one could help his son. No one had been able to help anybody else in his family when they had the White Death, and it was just a matter of time before his son died. But he let the neighbors inside anyway, if only because seeing a few familiar faces might lift his son's spirits. When George and the visitors rounded the corner into Edwin's room, most of the neighbors went to Edwin's bedside to say hello, but the older woman walked directly towards Dr. Metcalf and began speaking to him in a very hushed voice. George was curious, so he walked closer to listen, and he heard this woman tell Dr. Metcalf that she actually knew how to cure Edwin. The doctor told her that was not possible, nobody could cure this sickness. But the woman said Edwin was not sick, he was actually cursed by a vampire. George watched Dr. Metcalf's face go red with anger. He told the woman that she was being absolutely ridiculous. The doctor then looked over at George like he wanted somebody to back him up here, but George was desperate enough to consider anything at this point, and as crazy as a vampire's curse sounded, he didn't think it was that far-fetched, and so he wanted to hear more from this woman. After all, the White Death had made his loved ones look like the life was being sucked out of them, almost like a vampire was draining their blood. And just earlier that night, Edwin had said something to George that totally caught him off guard when he said, "She was here, she haunts me." And so George wondered if maybe his son was referencing this vampire. And so George turned from the doctor to his son and asked him about what he had said earlier about somebody being in the room with him, somebody haunting him. And Edwin croaked out that earlier, when he was alone in the room, he had seen this woman standing in the corner of his bedroom, staring at him with cold, dead eyes. Now, he said he didn't know if this had been a dream or not, but it had felt so real that now he was scared to death from the experience. To George, his son's testimony only seemed to strengthen the neighbor's vampire theory. However, George told the older woman that he wanted proof that this really is what was going on, that a vampire was behind what was happening to his family. And so the older woman called over another one of the neighbors, a farmer that George sometimes shared crops with, and he told George and Dr. Metcalf that he'd seen cases like this before. He explained that sometimes when a person died, a dark supernatural force would take over their body and cause them to leech the life out of their surviving loved ones, even from beyond the grave. These people were not really dead, the farmer said, they were vampires. At this point, the older woman interrupted the farmer and said to figure out which one of George's deceased family members was the vampire, all they had to do was exhume the bodies of his wife and 2 daughters. If one of the women's bodies hadn't yet decomposed, or if her heart still contained blood, that was a telltale sign that she was the vampire. To George, this whole process sounded barbaric, and he couldn't bear the thought of seeing his wife and children's decomposing bodies. But for all he knew, his neighbors could be right, and this could be his only chance to save his only son. So George gave the neighbors his blessing to go dig up his family members' bodies, and then George turned to Dr. Metcalf and, said he couldn't go and see this, and so asked the doctor to please go to the graveyard on his behalf. That way the doctor could be his eyes and also be the voice of reason. A few minutes later, Dr. Metcalf trudged through the dirt, lagging behind the neighbors, as they made their way toward the Chestnut Hill Cemetery. Between the 7 of them, they had 3 small lanterns, one of which Dr. Metcalf was holding to light his way. As the doctor walked along, he could hear the neighbors up ahead of him whispering about this vampire and what they were going to do, and it was hard for the doctor not to feel totally annoyed because he did not believe a curse was behind what was happening to George's family. But he reminded himself that George was utterly desperate and had really kind of convinced himself that maybe this curse really was the thing, and Dr. Metcalf didn't have the heart to just completely shoot it down. And so if this is what it took, going along with the neighbors to the graveyard to prove that George's son Edwin was not suffering from some kind of ridiculous curse, then ultimately this was worth it. Eventually, the neighbors and the doctor reached the cemetery's iron gates, which creaked as the farmer pushed them open. To the right of the entrance, Dr. Metcalf could see a stone crypt, and next to it, he could see the Brown family's plot. And it didn't take long for the group to locate the tombstones they were looking for. Dr. Metcalf stood a few feet away and watched while 2 of the neighbors held up lanterns and 3 others stuck shovels into George's wife's grave. They threw dirt to the side until eventually they unearthed her wooden coffin. The leader of the neighbors, the older woman who brought up the vampire curse, unlatched the casket, pulled it open, and revealed the dusty skeleton of George's late wife. She'd been dead for 9 years, and so her body had, like Dr. Metcalf had expected, totally decomposed. To the neighbors, though, this only meant that George's wife was not the vampire, but one of the 2 daughters was. So they reburied the wife and dug up George's first daughter, the one who had died just a few months after George's wife. And again, when they opened up the coffin, it was just full of bones, and so they reburied the daughter as well. And then finally, the neighbors exhumed Mercy, the second daughter, who had died just 8 weeks earlier. And what they found inside of her casket struck even Dr. Metcalf, the most skeptical person there, as absolutely inexplicable. Despite having been dead for 2 full months by this point, Mercy's body had not even begun to decompose. And to make things even stranger, Mercy's body was lying on its side, as if she had literally turned over in her grave after being buried. The gray-haired woman turned to Dr. Metcalf and pointed and said, "Look, there's your vampire." The doctor, who was admittedly kind of shaken up, still insisted there had to be some kind of rational medical explanation for this, but the neighbors wouldn't listen. They had already begun performing a ritual that they believed would kill the vampire, break the curse, and save Edwin's life. The neighbors gathered up twigs and arranged them on top of a nearby boulder. Then the farmer flicked a match and kindled the flame into a small bonfire. And then Dr. Metcalf watched in stunned silence as the older woman pulled something out of a bag that she'd carried into the cemetery. And in the flickering light, he saw a flash of silver, and he realized what the woman had pulled from her bag was a huge kitchen knife. And then Dr. Metcalf looked on in horror as the woman stuck that blade directly into Mercy's abdomen, slicing her stomach open, and then the woman reached up under Mercy's ribs and pulled out her liver and her heart. And then after opening them up, both organs were indeed still full of coagulated blood, as though Mercy's body had been using these organs recently. At this point, the old woman placed Mercy's organs on top of the fire and let them burn down to ash. But after that, the ritual was not done. The older woman pulled something else out of her bag. It was a jar full of water, and she unscrewed the cap. Then she scooped the ashes of the organs and put them into this water, then closed the jar and shook up the contents. The woman said the ritual was almost complete. All they needed to do now was have Edwin drink this entire concoction of water and his sister's burned organs. The neighbors turned and began marching out of the cemetery, and Dr. Metcalf, who was still just shocked by everything he had just seen, kind of chased after them, begging them to stop, but none of them even looked back. They were on a mission. A little while later that evening, Edwin was propped up in bed, feeling lifeless and miserable, surrounded by his father, Dr. Metcalf, and the group of neighbors. Edwin held the jar of black liquid in his hands, but he hadn't drunk any of it yet. Instead, he listened as Dr. Metcalf and the older woman argued. Dr. Metcalf said that if Edwin drank that, it would only make him sicker. But the older woman insisted it was the only medicine that would cure him. Edwin looked to his father for some advice about what to do, but George told Edwin it was up to him. Staring at the watery ashes of his own sister's heart and liver, Edwin almost began to gag. He couldn't decide what to do. If he drank this vile liquid, he could die, but if he didn't drink it, he would still very likely die. So he ultimately decided he had nothing to lose. He unscrewed the jar's cap, brought the black water to his lips, and began to drink. But despite drinking his sister's burned liver and heart, 2 months after this ritual, Edwin still died of the White Death. The ritual had not worked. And after losing his only son, George Brown's life continued to get worse. Over the next 6 years, 3 more of his daughters would die of the White Death, leaving him with only one child, his daughter Hattie. George lived another 2 decades. However, his one remaining child, Hattie, would outlive George by about another 40 years. She would die in 1954, but she lived long enough to actually see a cure developed for the White Death, because it would turn out the White Death was not some curse caused by a vampire. It was actually a very common and very deadly infectious disease called tuberculosis, and by 1954, a vaccine had been developed. But back in the late 1800s, tuberculosis was a global epidemic. It was highly infectious, often spreading amongst families or other tight-knit social groups, and it accounted for 25% of all deaths in the northeastern United States, where the Brown family lived. But despite how common it was, tuberculosis was very poorly understood. There were many different types, and the symptoms could vary widely, so it wasn't always accurately diagnosed. And even when it was, there was no effective medications, so treatment was mostly guesswork. Although almost everyone in New England at the time knew someone who had died of tuberculosis, the Brown family had a uniquely horrible experience. They lived in an isolated, half-abandoned community where superstition reigned. So when they started coming down with the so-called White Death, which was a nickname for tuberculosis, their neighbors thought they'd become the victim of a vampire, and when they exhumed Mercy and found that her body had not decomposed, they took that as proof that she possessed supernatural powers and was behind the curse. But just like Dr. Metcalf suspected on the night where they exhumed her, there actually was a rational explanation for why Mercy's body had not decomposed. Mercy died in the middle of the harsh New England winter, when the ground was so frozen that it would have been impossible to actually dig a grave. So instead of being buried underground in the cemetery next to her mother and sister, she was still buried in the cemetery, but above ground in that stone crypt, where her body was naturally frozen and preserved. As for why her body appeared to have rolled over inside of her coffin, that was most likely because the neighbors had moved the casket as they opened it and sort of accidentally shifted her remains. However, Mercy's reputation as a vampire lived on, and her story made headlines all across the country, and in fact, in 1896, one article about Mercy the Vampire made it into the hands of an aspiring novelist named Bram Stoker. He would release Dracula 1 year later, and the book featured a young woman who was turned into a vampire and later had her body exhumed. The character's name was Lucy, a combination of Mercy and her middle name, which was Lena.
Many people have claimed over the years to have been abducted by aliens, and realistically there's no tangible evidence that any human being has ever actually set foot in an extraterrestrial spacecraft or another dimension or anything like that. It's just these crazy stories from people that claim this happened to them. And while many of these stories are very quickly cast aside as absolute hoax, not true, not accurate, there's one story, one abduction story that is universally regarded as the most believable and most famous alien abduction story, and that is of Travis Walton. What made this case so famous is that unlike all of the other alien abduction cases where there was never any proof, it was usually one person's first-hand account. In this case, you have a full-scale police investigation. You have up to 16 lie detector tests that were taken by Travis Walton himself, along with the other witnesses and people that were there. And you have a group of 6 level-headed guys that actually witnessed the abduction take place and have stuck to their story and have passed all lie detector tests and have never changed their story in 40 years. And you would think that at some point you might change your story because they came under incredible scrutiny. I mean, it basically derailed most of their careers and their lives because they were labeled as crazy people for believing that a UFO had abducted Travis Walton. I mean, in a way, they became famous, but in all the worst ways. So you have all these elements that make this story seem fairly credible. And even if this wasn't an alien abduction, let's say, how do you account for the past lie detector tests that are talking about UFOs? How do you account for the fact that Travis Walton was really missing for 5 days and has no idea where he was? And there was a full search effort to find him in the area where he would have been. So lots of unanswered questions, but the story itself of when he was actually abducted, and then his own story about what happened once he had been abducted, it makes for just an incredible story. It's been converted into books and movies, and to this day, it remains one of, if not the single most fascinating purported alien abduction stories ever. But before we get into today's story, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, well then you've come to the right channel, because that's all I do, and I upload 3 to 4 of these stories every week. So if that's something that interests you, I would encourage you to gently extirpate the like button and then subscribe to my channel and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. All right, let's dive into the story. By 1975, Travis Walton, who was 22 years old at the time, had developed a bad boy reputation in his hometown of Snowflake, Arizona. He rode a noisy Harley-Davidson motorcycle through town. He was a wild bull rider and he was a boxer. And there was a story about Travis when He was with his friends in a car and they were driving down this road and a bear jumped out of the woods and landed in the middle of the road and was just standing there. And Travis, without any hesitation, leaps out of his car and chases after this huge bear and scares it into the woods, and in fact chased it up into the woods. So Travis was just known as this kind of rebel, problem child a little bit, but he was beloved by his friends. He was just like one of those cool guys that he did it his own way. So Travis and the 6 other men that he worked with were loggers. They were given contracts and they would go out and they would clear trees in a certain area. They were not big time with huge equipment to do this. We're talking chainsaws, regular saws and axes. And they would just go out, these blue collar, like hard working type guys, and they would clear areas of trees. That's what they did. Now these 7 men, they did a dangerous job. I mean, you're cutting down these huge trees and you're usually working pretty quickly. You're operating, chainsaws that are pretty dangerous. And Mike Rogers, who was the crew boss, who was there the day of this event, he described in a number of his interviews that, the men that he hired to do these jobs, they needed to be incredibly level-headed. They did not strike you as people that would have this fantastical, alien encounter story. On November 5th, 1975, Mike Rogers was given a contract to clear out this huge 1,200-acre plot of land inside of the Sitgreaves National Forest. And he grabbed his crew, they piled into the one pickup truck that Mike owned, and Mike knew that this was going to be a really difficult job. It was a huge area to cover, and he told his men up front, we're going to be working really hard, so expect long, full days. And so over the first 3 days of the job, even though they were working, long hours and barely taking any breaks, they were behind schedule. At the end of this 3rd day, it's late at night, they've worked all day and everybody is just totally exhausted. And so finally they wrap up and they all pile back into Mike's truck, all 7 of them, and they start driving the access road back down to the main road to get back to the town. And as they're driving, they're not really talking about work at all. They're kind of joking about what they're going to do that night. And as they're driving down the road, and again, it's heavily forested, they look off to the right and there is some lights in the forest. They would say in interviews that they all noticed it, but it did not stand out as anything particularly bad. It just could be anything. They weren't thinking about it. But as they were driving down this road and this light, I guess, got brighter, or maybe they couldn't help but notice it, they all started commenting on this light and they're looking at it, and somebody suggested that, oh, it's probably just the moon, it's a full moon. But then one of the guys on the other side of the truck happened to look out his side, away from where that light was, and he goes, no, the moon's over here, it's on this side of the road. So they're like, okay, it's not the moon. And then someone suggested, oh, well, maybe it's a forest fire. Like, maybe we should go check it out, that could be a forest fire. But then Mike Rogers, the driver, the crew boss, was like, no, there'd be smoke, there's no smoke or anything. And Travis, who, he's the guy that's jumping out of cars to go chase down bears, and he's like a total kind of adrenaline junkie type. He's like, hey, let's just drive over there and see what it is. Like, I don't know, it could be anything. Let's go check it out. The guys in the truck were a little on edge about it, but ultimately said, what's the harm? We'll drive over. We know there's a road that brings us over to that section of the forest. We'll get a look at whatever this is, and then we'll leave. So they drive down this other little access road, and they come to a clearing where these lights were, and they are astounded at what they see. They were all polygraphed separately about what they saw when they reached this clearing. Each of them described the same thing with slightly different details because it's from their own perspective, and the polygraph tests all showed that they were telling the truth. They saw this disc-shaped craft with what looked like panels of lights on the underside, hovering in a clearing maybe 50 or 100 feet off the ground, not spinning or anything, just floating in midair, as if it was suspended. And the men, in their interviews later on TV shows and books, they would say what struck them was not just the fact that there's this craft here, but how bizarre it was to see this thing defying gravity. It's not moving, but it's hovering over the air and it's right in front of us. And one of the men even commented at length, because he would build houses and he was a handy guy. And he started talking about the structural framework of this craft. He could see that there was really impressive engineering on the underside of this craft. It was just this beautiful machine. And they're looking at it, and Travis is so excited when they get to this clearing. He doesn't even know what he's looking at, but much like the bear, where he jumps out and chases the bear, as soon as they were almost at a stop in this clearing right next to the ship, he's jumping out of the car. Nobody else is, just Travis. And he starts walking just a little ways away from the car towards this craft. The craft doesn't move. The craft is maybe, from where they parked, maybe 50 or 100 feet away from them, and then 50 or 100 feet in the air. And the crew doesn't say anything. They're just dumbfounded by what they're looking at. Travis is also dumbfounded, but he's walking towards the ship. And he would say in an interview that he was frightened, but he was mostly curious. He knew he was looking at something that no one knew what it was. Some sort of craft. They didn't know what it was, but it was fascinating to him. And he kept walking closer and closer and closer to it. And as the crew kind of came out of their initial shock of seeing this unidentified flying object in the sky, they start yelling for Travis to come back. They had this bad sense that something was going to happen, and they thought you shouldn't go near it, like, come back. Not to mention it's hovering in the air. What if it falls and it lands on you? Like, hey, Travis, come back over here. And then it was like once one person started yelling for Travis to come back, they all did. And so Travis remembered hearing them screaming for him to come back to the car. But he's not really paying any attention. He's still walking. And finally he stops. He's just looking at it. And Travis would say he was just struck at just the beauty of the underside of this craft with all these different panels of lights built into it. It was this incredible piece of machinery. And he's looking at it, and then all of a sudden it starts spinning just a little bit. And it starts emitting this noise that all of them reported hearing, this loud mechanical sound. And now the yells from the crew are getting louder and louder. And Travis would say that he knew he needed to turn around and go back, but he just wanted to look for a few more seconds. And he was about to turn and go back to the truck when all of a sudden a beam of light comes out and strikes Travis like a lightning strike. And all of the crew saw this happen. He gets blown 20 feet away. Like he gets lifted off the ground and thrown 20 feet. And they watched it happen. And again, in all of their polygraph tests, they all said the same thing. All passed. He was hit by a ray of light from this UFO, knocked him 20 feet back. Mike Rogers, in a panic, along with everybody else in the crew, they just decide to leave. And they're convincing themselves, as Mike is driving away like a maniac, leaving Travis behind, they're convincing themselves that he's dead already. We just watched him get shot by something. We don't know what that is. And they're freaked out. They don't even know what they saw. They're crying. They're hysterical. These are grown men, just absolutely terrified. And they're driving a little ways until finally Mike just hits the brakes and he stops. And Mike is like, we have to go back for him. He was like, if you guys want to stay here and wait for me, that's fine. But this truck is going back to get Travis. And so the idea of waiting out in the open after seeing what they just saw was even worse than going back. They wanted to stay together. So a little bit begrudgingly, although they knew they needed to, they all got back in the truck, turned around and started driving back up to the UFO site. As they make it back up, they notice that there is no lights up there. The craft is gone and there's no Travis. And they get out, and now Mike is uncontrollably crying because he feels like they just abandoned him, and where did he go? Everybody else is in shock. They can't believe it. They start screaming for Travis. They're running around the woods, yelling for Travis, looking for signs of Travis. They really don't know what happened, but they know Travis is not here. And after a little bit of time of looking, they're like, we have to tell the police. And they knew that it was going to be bad for them when they told police. The story is, a UFO came and zapped Travis and now he's gone. That doesn't really sit well with police. But they knew, because they wanted to find Travis and they were very concerned about their friend, they knew they had to tell police. Mike and a few of the other crew were just unable to even think. They were crying, they were upset. And so finally they get to a payphone, the first payphone they saw, because it's 1975. And Ken Peterson, who was this very kind of simple, matter-of-fact guy, recently married, just very simple guy, very level-headed guy. He decides to call the police because he's the only one who was, I guess, composed enough to do it. And so he calls the sheriff's department and he says, you got to come out here. We can't find our friend Travis Walton. We'll have to describe it to you when you get here because trying to do it over the phone is not going to do it justice, but he's gone and we don't know where he went. So shortly thereafter, Sheriff Marlon Gillespie and Ken Copeland, they're partners, they show up at this rest stop where this payphone was, and they get to the scene. They see Ken Peterson, who made the call to them, and they're like, all right, tell us what's going on. The crew has now gotten out of the truck. They look distraught for sure. And Ken begins to try to describe what happened, but he hasn't said UFO, he hasn't said aliens, he's just said, we were up at the logging site, we had a contract up there, and then, just, it's hard to describe, and Mike Rogers jumps in, he's like, we saw a UFO, and a ray of light hit Travis, and then he disappeared. And the sheriffs are looking at them like, really? And so they stopped them and were like, all right, I need to search your truck to make sure you guys aren't under the influence of something. And they're like, we haven't done anything. We've been working all day. They search the truck, nothing. They check each of them to see if they're sober, and their field test showed they were all sober. And the Sheriff Gillespie, who was the overall in charge sheriff, even though he was a total skeptic, and so was Sheriff Copeland as well, he would say about that first engagement with the 6 crew members that they were obviously shaken up by something. Something had happened. They don't know what it was, but they were shaken up. And what Sheriff Gillespie believed was that they were creating a hoax to cover up a real crime. He believed that they had harmed Travis Walton and they were using a UFO to cover it up. But he also was thinking to himself, like, this is a bad hoax. It's not very well planned. They don't really have their stories really lined up particularly well. They're not doing a good job explaining it. The only thing they're doing well is acting scared. A couple hours later, the sun's starting to come up because it was super late when all this happened. And Sheriff Gillespie and Sheriff Copeland have organized this huge search effort up in the forest where Travis had gone missing. And the crew members, they're all there as well. A bunch of volunteers showed up and they are scouring the area. I mean, they got dogs out, they got these huge teams looking everywhere, and they can't come up with anything. I mean, they're looking everywhere, there's no sign, there's nothing. There's nothing from Travis. And so while this is all going on, Sheriff Copeland and Sheriff Gillespie have started coming over to Mike Rogers and the rest of the crew and being like, hey, if you just tell us where Travis Walton's body is, like, we'll go easy on you guys. Like, we know you did it. And they can feel that the pressure is really mounting, that if they don't find Travis, even though they didn't do anything, according to their story, they're going to face serious repercussions because that's the way the world works. You don't get to say aliens did this and not have any blame placed on you because there's no proof. They just have their own eyewitness testimony. That's it. And so the crew has started to become very worried about what's going to happen. They're worried about Travis, of course, but they're starting to see that, like, they're going to be prosecuted for this unless they find Travis. And so they're all very stressed out. And they noticed during the search, this first day of searching, that these 3 guys wearing red jackets had these tools that were scanning the ground, almost like a metal detector. And Mike Rogers, he was hoping that during this investigation that they would have people come out that were like paranormal investigators. I guess maybe he was naive to think that the police would actually do that. But he thought, given the fact that we've all said this is a UFO that zapped Travis, who then disappeared, that they would have at least one person representing the kind of paranormal side of the investigation coming out. And so he sees these guys in red with their special tools that seem like a metal detector, and his gut says they're paranormal investigators. And so Mike goes over to them and he's like, hey, what are these tools you guys are doing? Like, what is this? And they look at him and they're like, oh, well, this tests for radiation. We're scanning for radiation in the area. And he asked them, like, well, what group are you guys with? Are you with the sheriff's department? And they just didn't really answer him. They said, oh, we're just checking for radiation in the area. That's just what we do. And Mike sees an opportunity because when that ship emitted that ray of light that ultimately blew Travis Walton 20 feet and then, evaporated him or something, they were within range of that big ball of lightning, and they were very much in the kind of cone where, had there been radiation coming off of that ship, he believed that perhaps they would have been hit with it. And so he asked the guys with the red jackets on and their little radiation tools to scan the crew's jackets and bodies to see if they were radioactive. And so the crew comes over and they scan them, and there's nothing. There's no trace elements of radioactivity. They're like, no, there's nothing. And then Mike realizes that from the time they called the sheriff until this search, they had all the crew gone home and changed, then come out to do this search. And so he thought, well, then, any of the radioactive materials would have been on our clothes, which aren't here, but we have our hard hats in the back of the truck that were out here the whole time. They were potentially exposed to whatever was out there from the ship. Can you test those? And so he brought over one of their helmets, and the guy in red scans his helmet, and the ticker goes all the way over, fully radioactive. And the guy in red looked up at Mike and looked down at the helmet, and he's scanning it, and he's looking at him kind of trying to size him up. And then he turns and he kind of gestures at the other two in red and tells them to stop doing what they're doing. And they come over and they're scanning the helmets as well. And then without any indication of what the results were, what this meant, because Mike is kind of waiting for them to tell them what's going to happen, the guys in red just turn around and say, okay. And they just start walking away. And Mike's like, well, wait, what does this mean? And they don't turn around and they just walk away from the search site. And so the other crew are watching this happen too. And Mike and the crew are trying to get them to come back, but they're not turning around. They're just leaving and then they're gone. And so Mike goes over to the sheriffs, who they know the sheriffs think they did something to Travis. These are not their friends, but they figured we need to ask them who those guys in red were. So they go over to Sheriff Gillespie and they're like, hey, who were those guys in red jackets with the radiation detectors? And Sheriff Gillespie's like, who? There's no one here looking for radiation. Everyone here is here because I ordered them to be here. Who are they? Where are they? And he's like, well, they just walked over there. They went around the corner there. And Sheriff Gillespie's like, well, I didn't order them there. And it would turn out that they couldn't locate these three people. No one knew who they were. Mike went around and asked anybody who seemed like an authority figure if they knew who these people were. They asked people if they had interacted with them, and no one knew. So after this search that goes on for a couple of days, turns up nothing. There's no sign of Travis. The town of Snowflake, Arizona really turned on the 6 crew members. Everybody believed that they had done something to Travis, that this UFO thing was a hoax and that they harmed Travis and they were using this as a cover-up. And the sheriff department, they really perpetuated that. They were pretty open about, this is not a UFO situation, this is not an alien abduction, this is a missing person case, and frankly, we believe the UFO thing is a hoax. National and international media had picked this story up, and it became this massively viral story all over the world. And news media outlets are converging on Snowflake, Arizona, and they're inundating the sheriff's department with requests for more information about this alien abduction, and it's really frustrating the 2 sheriffs who are leading this investigation, Sheriff Gillespie and Sheriff Copland. And they were already skeptical and really upset about feeling like they were being taken advantage of by these crew members, this hoax, right? That's what they believed it was. And so Sheriff Gillespie and Copland decide, you know what? We're going to just cut through all the BS here and we're going to make these boys take a lie detector test. So they go out and get one of the country's best polygraph examiners to come in and administer a lie detector test on each of the 6 crew members. And so one by one over the course of the day, each crew member was tested for 2 hours, same questions, all centering on the criminal side, the kind of foul play angle for Travis Walton. They all go through it. And it turned out that 5 of the 6 had all shown that they were telling the truth. And the 6th person, it was just inconclusive. It didn't mean that he was lying. It just meant that the test wasn't done very well. And this polygraph examiner had anywhere from a 92 to 98% accuracy rate. He was one of the best in the country. And he even would say, it would be so difficult to fake that. To have 5 people, let's say this is all a big hoax and they harmed Travis Walton. It would be almost impossible to have 5 people be able to pass my examination and have nobody slip up. They were telling the truth. And so the examiner tells the sheriff, and Sheriff Gillespie is dumbfounded because he believed that they were going to find out they were all lying and that this could just be a pure criminal investigation and it would be, let's go find Travis Walton's body. But now the examiner is saying they're telling the truth. And so Detective Gillespie and his partner are like, now what do we do? And then 5 days after Travis's disappearance, Travis shows back up. During numerous interviews, Travis would say that he remembers waking up on a road and he didn't recognize where he was, but it was nighttime, it was raining, and he sensed a very bright light above him. And so as he's laying, he kind of turns his head to look up into the sky and he sees what looks like the underside of that ship because he remembered how struck he was by the beauty of the kind of engineering underneath that disc UFO they saw in the forest, it looked the same. His vision was not great, but he's looking up and he's pretty confident that's what he's looking at. And then it flies into the sky and it's gone. And he's left in total darkness on a road in some place he doesn't know. And he remembers standing up and feeling very weak and depleted and dehydrated. And he just knew that he had to get to civilization. He had to just go in a direction and find someone who could help him, because he was so weak and he would die out there if he didn't find someone who could help. And so he musters the strength to stand up and he starts kind of staggering down the road. And eventually, through just adrenaline, he just starts running. And luckily, he sees up ahead there is a rest stop. And at rest stops, there's payphones. And he makes his way down and he goes to the payphone and he has change in his pocket still. He puts it in the payphone and he ends up calling his brother. And his brother he can't believe he's talking to Travis, because Travis is probably supposed to be dead at this point. He didn't believe it was Travis, but Travis just said to him over and over again, "It's me. They brought me back." And he tells him where he is, because now he recognizes that this rest stop is actually in Snowflake, Arizona. When his brother picks him up, Travis would say that he believed that this was just minutes after, the initial abduction. He didn't even know he had been abducted. This is like he's coming to and he's like, "Man, what happened? Like, I was just over at that clearing where I saw this ship and now I'm over here. Like, what am I doing here?" And so Travis's brother is looking at him like, "Where have you been? We've been so worried about you for the past several days." And Travis, who was kind of almost catatonic, he's in shock. He doesn't know what's going on. He looks at his brother and he's like, "What do you mean days?" And his brother's like, "You've been missing for 5 days." And so Travis would say that when he heard this news, this revelation that he had been missing for 5 days, it absolutely put him into shock. He was in a catatonic state where he couldn't make sense of it. And so he just sat there quietly. And his brother's looking at him, not really sure what to even ask. He asked a couple times what happened and Travis just didn't answer because he didn't know. He couldn't explain it. And so Travis's brother decides, instead of just immediately calling the police, "I want to bring you to a hospital," because clearly that needs to happen. And frankly, with the media circus, as soon as they find out you're back, it's just going to be mayhem. And I want to make sure you're taken care of first. So he drives to Phoenix, Arizona, and he brings him to a hospital. And he asks the doctors to be discreet, and he has a doctor do an examination. The doctor knew who Travis Walton was because he'd been following the news. And he's doing an examination of Travis, and he was malnourished and he was tired and looked very sick. But there was no physical wounds, with the exception of he had one puncture site in his arm, in the crook of his arm. Travis was not a drug user, so it wasn't like that was, a mark from using drugs. It was a puncture site, and they assumed someone had recently put a needle in his arm. And also the doctor drug tested him and tested his blood, and there was no drugs in his system. It wasn't like he'd been using any sort of substance. So he kind of had a clear bill of health, minus the injection site and looking pretty ragged. And so after the examination, Travis's brother brings Travis back to his home in Phoenix, Arizona. As soon as they get back, his home phone is getting constant phone calls. It had made its way to the sheriff's department back in Snowflake, Arizona, and they are nonstop calling Travis's brother. Like, "Hey, we hear he's back. We have to talk to him. We have to talk to him." Sheriff Gillespie, he drives all the way to Phoenix. He goes in and he sits down to talk to Travis. And Sheriff Gillespie would say that Travis looked like he was in shock. He looked like he had been through something traumatic. It did not seem like he was acting. And he starts asking Travis what happened. And Travis, he does mention the UFO. He mentions seeing this thing in a clearing. He gets struck by some light. He doesn't know what it was. And then, he's on the road 5 days later and he can't really make sense of what happened. He just didn't really know what happened over the 5 days. And finally, Sheriff Gillespie just kind of doesn't really give up. He's like, "Well, we have no way to arrest him. We have no proof of anything." And so he decided, "We're going to be in touch," and he drives back. And then media starts showing up. Huge news trucks start showing up outside. Everybody found out, because this was a huge story, where he was, and everybody wanted answers. Finally, the National Enquirer, they reached out and they said, "Hey, if you give us an exclusive story, if Travis speaks to us about what happened to him, we will get you out of here. We'll bring you to a private location, and we'll even pay to have Travis undergo a whole other battery of tests that are not typically done to see if they could figure out what had happened to him." And so they agree to go with the National Enquirer. So by the time he's actually sitting there looking at the National Enquirer, he's had a little bit of time to maybe let his memory kind of kick back in about what had happened. And he's having these flashes of memory of what happened over those 5 days, because initially all he could remember was seeing the craft and then being on the road 5 days later. And so when he's sitting down with the National Enquirer people, he begins to recall what actually happened over those 5 days. And so this is what he said happened. He said that he remembers getting out of the truck and walking up to this craft. And he remembers his crew members yelling at him to come back. He knew they were yelling at him to come back. He just wanted to look at the craft a little bit longer. And then right as he was about to turn around and head back, the craft started moving. This loud kind of mechanical, eerie sound is being made. And before he had a chance to run back, he gets hit with this lightning bolt of some kind. Then he remembers being in the presence of some doctors. He saw white lab coats, masks, and facial coverings, and he's kind of in and out of consciousness, and he's, this orange light around him, but he definitely sees what looks like medical professionals, and he's thinking to himself, whatever happened with that ship, it must have hurt me, and my crew must have scooped me up and brought me to the hospital. And so in his kind of in and out state, he's aware that he's around medical professionals, at least what he believes are medical professionals. And at some point, his vision clears. It goes from foggy and he's in and out to being pretty much lucid. And he looks down at his chest, and there's a rectangular box sitting on his chest that he didn't recognize. It didn't really look like modern medical equipment. It just looked like this almost like rock sitting on his chest. And he looks at that, and then he looks up at one of the people who's wearing a mask, who's working on him, one of the medical professionals. And this person is working on this box, and then the person looks at Travis Walton and then leans in to look even closer at Travis Walton, and Travis is horrified. It was this grayish, thin, narrow-headed figure that was very short, maybe like 4 feet high, who was looking in at him, and its eyes were like slits. And it's looking at Travis, and Travis, who's unbelievably scared at this point, pushes everything off of him and rips out all the cords that are attached to him, kind of topples off of this table that he was on, and he realizes he's in a fairly small room, and there's 3 of these humanoid creatures in the room with him. And he picks up the biggest instrument he can see next to the table that he was just laying on. He didn't know what it was, and he starts kind of wildly waving it at them and screaming to leave him alone, like, get away from me. And he's trying to make sense of what he's looking at, and the 3 figures in lab coats start walking closer and closer to him. And they're just kind of looking up at him, trying to study him a little bit. They get all the way up to him, and he's waving, and he's almost about to hit one of them when they just kind of abruptly turn around and leave the room, leaving him alone in this kind of examination room. And as soon as they leave, he watches them go down the little, outside the door, down the little hallway, and they turn left. And so he's practically paralyzed with fear, but he knows if he can't get out of this room, he's done for. And so finally, he kind of gets himself together and he walks past the examination table. He goes down the hallway outside of the door, and instead of going left where they went, he kind of sneaks off to the right and starts walking. And he comes to another room, and it's a room that has a single chair in it. It's this tiny little room with a chair, and the chair is turned away from him. He begins to peer around the chair, and he sees that no one is sitting there. So he goes in front of the chair, and he's like touching the wall, looking for a doorknob or any sort of mechanism that can get him out of this room. And he said, like, the room, it was like this perfectly flat. Everything was flat and smooth. There was no door handles. He couldn't find a way out. And he ultimately sees on the chair that it looks like there's some buttons on the chair itself. And he pushes all these buttons on the chair and nothing happens. And then in the doorway where he came in, suddenly a person, a man, appears in the doorway, who's wearing what looks like a spacesuit, like an astronaut suit. And Travis is so immediately relieved, even though the weirdness of him being in an astronaut suit is pretty high. But he's like, it's a human. And he doesn't know what to think about the fact that he's now excited to see a human, right? Like, it's terrifying that you were just around these non-humans, but he's like in panic mode now. He sees another human being and he runs over to him and he says, please, you gotta help me. I don't know where I am. Where are we? What is this? What's going on? And he notices that the eyes of this person inside of the spacesuit, it's a man who at least looks like a man, but his eyes are distant. He's not making eye contact with Travis. It's like he's in a trance. And he said his eyes just seemed off, like they weren't focused on him. It would be like if you're talking to someone, but they were like permanently looking away from you. There was just something off about him, and he never spoke. And so he's trying to ask this guy, like, where are we? And the guy takes him by the arm and he just starts leading him back into the hall where he came from, and continued down the hall, not back towards the room where he was originally, but down the hall in the other direction. And they get to another door, and he opens it up, and Travis the whole time is like pleading with this guy to help him. And he thinks that this guy is helping him. He thinks that this is his savior. And he feels relieved that a human being, albeit a strange human being, is helping him. And eventually he stops asking him any questions because the guy in the spacesuit's just not reacting to him. They open this door and they go down into this huge hangar where there's all these spacecraft that look just like the one that he saw in the clearing, that Travis saw in the clearing. And they start walking down between all these spacecraft that are just hovering, much like they were hovering in the forest, seemingly able to just defy gravity. And the whole time, this guy in the spacesuit's saying nothing, and Travis is like, what is this? What are these craft? Is this military? Saying nothing. They walk to the far side of the hangar, and they open up another door, and they go into this bright white room. And there's 3 more human-like people with the strange eye thing going on in spacesuits that are standing there next to another medical table, and they're looking not at Travis, but their bodies are aimed in the direction of the door they came in through. Travis goes in and he sees these 3 and he thinks, these people are here to save me. Like, again, I feel relieved to see humans, albeit strange humans, but nonetheless humans. And the guy who had brought him in there continues to lead him over to the 3 other people, and they pick him up and they put him on the table. And he starts kind of resisting because he doesn't know what they're doing. They're not speaking. He's like, what are you doing? And they force him onto this table, and he's feeling pretty weak at this point. And they take a gas mask and they put it over his face. And then he blacks out. And his next memory after that is when he woke up on the road and had the light above him that flew away, and he had to run down to the payphone to call his brother. Travis did not immediately go and speak to the crew members that were there that night. It took quite a bit of time. He was talking to press, he was doing interviews, the police wanted to talk to him. There's a lot going on, but he eventually got together with the other 6 crew members, and they all met up at Mike Rogers, the crew boss's house, and they just said, you got to tell us what happened. And so he sits down and he tells the story. All of them believed him. They didn't want to believe him, but they believed him because they saw the first half of the story. They saw it for themselves. And once he was done telling it, they didn't really have that many questions. They just felt bad. They felt like if they had just stayed there and taken Travis, he wouldn't have been taken, but they didn't know that. And so all of them would leave Mike's house that day, and they would all go their separate ways. They did not stay in touch. They went their separate ways. It was like this hugely traumatic event that even to this day, 40 plus years later, when they talk about it, they're often brought to tears. Ken Peterson, his interviews are particularly striking because when he talks about it, he's an older man now. And he says, to this day, I'm scared to look out my window because I'm afraid I'm going to see a spaceship. And he starts crying when he talks about it. I mean, this had a profound impact on these 7 men. And some of them didn't do so well. This whole story, it ruined their credibility. Even though this is the most believable alien abduction story, the truth is most people think it's a hoax. One of them, like his own family, basically disowned him because they felt so embarrassed about this whole story and they don't believe him. So if this was a hoax, like to what end? What did they get out of it? Nothing. It damaged their lives. Following this case over the span of 40 years, there would be 16 lie detector tests taken, 5 by Travis Walton and 11 by the remaining crew, and they would all pass. The one member of that initial polygraph set, when 5 had passed and 1 was inconclusive, he was retested, the same exact test, and he did pass. It's just one of those things where we're left with this incredible story where modern technology says they're telling the truth, but we can't fit that truth into what we think of as normal life. And so we've just decided that there's going to be a group of people that believe and there's going to be a group of people that don't. And you're left to pick which side you're on.